right. Well, as you're grabbing a seat right now, the ushers are going to come and take the offering this morning. And so if you brought that with you, you can get that out and prepare that. If you're here with us for the first time, please, and I mean this, please don't give. I know some of you are like, did a guy at a church just say, please don't give? Yeah, I did. So if you're just here with us for the first time hanging out, we're just glad you're here and just want to say, don't give, just hang out and have a good time with us. And it's good to celebrate today, isn't it? Yeah, you guys are excited down here. I like this, yeah. That's the band. I didn't realize that. You guys are always excited. Yeah. Nathan's like a Labrador retriever, always excited, right? There's a ball? Yes, yeah. Yeah, I love celebrating together, celebrating good things. Next month, my wife and I, we're going to celebrate 18 years of marriage next month. I know. Yeah, we got married when we were 12. Yeah. No, seriously, like I thought about this week and I was like, man, next month, 18 years. I remember hearing other guys say that and I was like, those guys are so old. And they were older than I am now. They had to be because there's no way. But 18 years is a long time. And unbelievably, with all that time, I still remember the first year really well. Anyone, like, you remember your first year of marriage? Like, it's been a while, but you still remember? Yeah. You know why you remember it? Because trauma sears things on your brain. Like, that's just a general rule. Like, you go through a traumatic experience, like a year of marriage, and you remember that year. Like, I remember sharing in that year, was like, are we ever going to make, like, if it's like this for the next 17, like, what? I remember, like, this is crazy. So, we did what all couples do. We're like, somebody must have written about this. Right? Like, we can't be the first ones to be like this. And so I remember we would get books. I think we still get books. But we like, can we figure this thing out? And so we would sit and read these books. I remember this one book that we got shortly after we'd been married. This book was talking about homes that people grow up in. And it identified like 5 different types of homes. And there really were only 2 that we were paying attention to. It identified these 2 houses as peace houses or this other one as truth houses. And so I remember like looking at this and being like, well, what's a peace house? This is what a peace home is. A peace home is a home where the primary concern of the individuals living in that home is that people would get along, right? That you would be okay, that you would feel encouraged, that at the end of the day, you would know you were loved. Like, that's the primary concern. And so conversations, interactions, everything's filtered with this whole idea of, well, let's make sure that this is a peaceful place. The truth home is a little different than that. The truth home is a home where if you have ideas, you state your ideas. And it doesn't matter if you violate peace to do so, right? Like, you just need to get the truth out there. Like, there's just something that, like, this has to be said, and if I don't say it, then anyone want to guess which one was my house? Yeah, I was the truth house. Like, you should have been around our table at dinner. Like, at dinner, like, people thought it was a fight. We were just conversing. Like, we just talked. It was like debating ideas. And her house at dinner wasn't quite like that. For her, sitting around at the dinner table was more peaceful. So then our table, she's on one end, I'm on the other. I'm ready for a battle. She's ready for some peace, right? So I remember us just having this conflict, like, who are you? Like, I remember she must have been thinking all the time, why do you have to be such a jerk, right? Like, you're a jerk. And I'm like, I'm not a jerk, I'm just telling the truth, right? And I'm thinking, like, why can't you just tell me the truth? And she said, because you don't want to hear it, right? I want to keep you happy, right? Like, that's just the way it goes. Now, what's interesting about this is, like, you finally come to this place of saying, like, how did I get that way, right? And there's really 2 logical reasons that happens. Reason number 1 is that we're biologically connected to these people called parents. And because there's kids in the service, we won't go into too much detail on how that happens. But we're biologically, there's this part of us that there's just something in us. I'm a truth person because of my parents and who I come from, and she's a peace person because of her parents and who she comes from. So there is this biological component to this, but then there's also this other part of it where we as human beings, we just tend to figure things out. Like, we look at a situation and we go, man, there's got to be a way to make this work better than it is right now. That's part of being a human being. And at some point for us as children, we're looking around our circumstance, and there are hundreds of these moments where we're watching interactions. We're seeing moms and dads and friends and family interact, and we start realizing this is the system that I live in. This is how I behave to make life work. And so it becomes a part of who we are. It starts to shape our identity. It starts to be a part of our character. There's integral parts of who we are and how we interact with each other that are formed by all of these hundreds of interactions we have as we grow. Now, I know some of you right now are thinking, what in the world does this have to do with Easter, right? Is this like a marriage conference, or is this an Easter service, right? When you start thinking about the question of religion, when you start asking questions about where does religion come from, the answer is exactly the same. There's a part of this that's just in us. There's a part of this that has stirred. Part of the reason that religion exists is because there's something going on inside of us. But then there's also this external reality that says there has to be something else to make this life work. If I could give you the history of religion in a nutshell, this is basically it. Where did religion come from? How did we come up with religion? Where was it birthed? What took place? If you look back at human history and you look back at the ancient civilizations, what you begin to recognize is that we had human beings who were living and breathing, human beings who were just trying to exist, trying to get by, trying to have children and have them live a long, healthy life. That's what life was all about. And while these human beings were just simply trying to thrive and live and be human, they, at the earliest time, began to recognize that there were forces that were outside of their control, that when they were trying to grow food, or when they were trying to find health, when they were dealing with the environment, they realized there were things like the sun that was outside of their control. There were things like rain. There were things like illness and disease. There were animals and predators. There were all these things in their life. And what they began to recognize was that of all of these things, there are very little of these things that I actually have control over. There must be somebody or something else out there that controls all of this. And so after time, as human beings are watching all of these things that are outside of their control and drawing some fairly good early conclusions that there must be something else besides me, they begin to think, well, maybe if I did something different, I could change how these forces, how these things that are controlling things like rain and earthquakes and animals and illnesses, maybe I could change how those forces behave towards me. And so humanity developed religious systems. When you look at the civilizations around the world, when you look at their ruins, what you commonly see in so many of these civilizations are altars where they made sacrifices. When there was something that needed to happen a particular sort of way, they would identify which god or which goddess controlled the outcome of that particular activity, and then they had prescribed certain sacrifices that would be made on this altar. And if they offered this sacrifice to this god or to that god, then whatever it was I was hoping for might have a better chance of coming true. And so we developed this idea that if I could do something, if I could behave a particular way, then the gods would be happy with me. Now, the problem with the altar is that it escalates. It continues to get more and more intense and more demanding, because if you make a little bit more in a particular year, like suddenly the crops are good, the sheep, they multiplied, you realize, well, I can't just give the gods what I gave them last year. Otherwise, they'll think I'm being stingy, and so I have to give them more. On the other hand, if things don't go really well, you draw the conclusion, well, I guess I must not have given you enough last year, and so I need to give you more. And so no matter what, the gods just keep demanding more and more and more, until eventually the sacrificial systems of humanity become barbaric. You know what's unbelievable? Unbelievable that in cultures around the globe, as we unpack those civilizations, we see a common thread of human sacrifice. You read in the Hebrew scriptures about the Hebrews' hatred for the god Molech, and that people hated the god Molech because the god Molech could only have his appetite satisfied by the sacrifice of children. People began sacrificing their very own children in an attempt to appease the gods. It becomes barbaric and primitive. And so deep in the human consciousness, deep inside of us, because of where we've come from, there is this primal sense of fear, this primal sense of worry, this primal sense of, is God going to be happy with me? There's this thing inside of us that says, I don't know where I stand with God, and I'm not sure if he's okay or not okay with me. Is God going to bless me, or is God going to punish me? There's this tension that exists. That, in a nutshell, is the birth of religion. It's also the birth of one of the most significant codependent relationships in human history, right? We are in this relationship with these crazy, narcissistic, emotional, distant, moody gods who can't be known. That is religion. And so because of that, for some of us, what do we do? I mean, eventually, if you look at religion for what it is, if you see its origins and where it came from, you have to make some sort of, if you're an educated person, at some point you have to say, well, what do we do with this? And so some people say, well, then we have to understand this better and make it fit into our culture. And so we adapt it, we shape it, we try to make religion work. Other people see it as just irrelevant. They think, why would we still try those things? And so we just dismiss it and say, well, I don't know, I'll just kind of ignore it and see how life goes if I don't pay attention. But then still others are adamant in their rejection of it, and they say, this is incredibly barbaric and primitive. Why would anybody participate in this? But very few people actually stop and look into history to see the other story that even the Bible describes taking place in the context of the birth of religion. The Bible tells this fascinating, different story that right in the middle, this isn't a story that comes out of a vacuum. This isn't something that just suddenly appears on the scene. In the middle of this civilization, in the middle of humanity and all of the gods and the seeking and the pleasing, emerges this story right from the middle of it that is remarkable when you look at it. It's a story of an individual named Abraham. We first begin to read his story and understand more about it when we look at Genesis chapter 12. It's fascinating because the story of Abraham emerges out of the Sumerian culture. Abraham was of Ur, this leading Sumerian city. The Sumerians worshipped all kinds of deities. And the story begins with Abraham hearing a voice. And the voice is God. And God speaks to Abraham. This is what he says in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 and 2. Listen to this. It said, now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I know you read this and you go, okay, that's really cool. Like you're reading out of Genesis, really old thing. That's awesome. Do you realize what a departure this is? Like in the middle of this system where people are sacrificing, giving, trying to keep the gods happy, trying to understand what they're all about, in the middle of this altar and all of these things, suddenly there's this voice. A being, someone that's actually speaking to a human, somebody that can be known. There's a relational component to this. This voice now speaks to Abraham and has something to say. And everyone, everywhere, up until this point, the gods were just out there, right? The gods are these distant gods that nobody can know what they're doing or what they're up to. And now we have this story, and this God came and interacted and spoke. He invades human history, and this is revolutionary. This is brand new. This is something that the world has never seen before. Now, it's interesting when you look at what this voice says in Genesis chapter 12. The voice actually says to Abraham, I want you to leave your father's house. You translate that to our culture, and this is like somebody telling that like 20-something kid that's still sleeping on his parents' basement couch, like, hey, it's time, like someone says it's time to leave your father's house, and we're like, it's time to like quit sleeping in the basement, right? It's time to quit borrowing your dad's tools, right? Time to quit watching his cable and sitting in his chair, right? Those of you that have kids or a little older, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? Like, quit messing with my stuff. Leave your father's house, right? Where's the remote? You know how many times a week I have to ask that question? Where's the remote? It's like an Easter egg hunt every day of the year for me. It's interesting because when God says to Abraham, leave your father's house, that meant something completely different. See, in this culture, your father's house, your father was the one who taught you how to appease the gods. Your father was the one that taught you the system, the rituals, the religion. Your father was the one that said, there are these gods, and they're upset with you. And yes, it's something that you did, right? And here's what you do. And so when a person had sheep that were sick, the father would say, here's what you do for sick sheep. You go get 4 pieces of barley. You get a sparrow. And they had these and then you go to this God on top of this mountain in this other country. And I know you have to travel for it, but trust me, it's worth it, right? It was sounded like a pyramid scheme right from the beginning, right? I know, and then they would go do that. Oh, your kids are sick. Okay, here's what you do for a sick kid. There's this other God, the God of sick kids, right? Right? Unfortunately, there was no God of disappearing remotes, so that didn't happen. There wasn't one of those. But that's what the father did. The father showed the children how to walk in the ways of appeasing these gods. And God speaks to Abraham, and he says, leave the house of your father. What he's saying to Abraham is, I no longer want you to interact the way that your father has. This is so revolutionary that the Jews throughout history have had stories of the significance of this moment in Abraham's life. In fact, rabbis taught these other stories alongside of this to illustrate how significant this was. And even today in Hebrew schools, Jewish boys and girls learn these stories out of the Talmud. There's this one particular story where Abraham, on the night before he leaves his father's house, takes an axe and goes into the room, the living room, next to the big screen TV, where all of the idols are piled up. He takes an axe and he crushes all of the idols and smashes them except for one. And he takes the axe and he puts it in the hands of this idol and then waits for his dad to wake up. His dad wakes up and walks out, sees that this TV's okay, right? But everything else, he goes, what happened here? What happened? And Abraham says, I think you know what happened, right? And the father looks at Abraham and says, how is this even possible? I carved these idols with my own hands. It's not possible that they could do this. And Abraham says, then why do you worship them? God says to Abraham, I want you to leave your father's house. But there's this one point a little later when he walks Abraham out and has him stare at the stars in the sky. And he says, I want you to look at the stars in the sky. And he says, see the stars. You will have children that outnumber the stars. Now for us, we hear that and we go, there's a lot of stars. That means he's going to have a lot of children. That's pretty simple. But Abraham was a Sumerian. Sumerians worshipped the stars. The stars were individual gods. And so now we have this God on the scene, and he's looking at the stars, and he's just using them as props, as illustrations. These gods are nothing but an illustration to this new God. He could have chosen sands in the sea or trees on the side of a hill, but this God chooses the former gods of Abraham to say, they're just there, and there's lots of them. Abraham did have a son. In fact, Father Abraham had many sons. And many sons had Father Abraham, right? He did have a son. And in Genesis chapter 22, this God who speaks says something interesting to Abraham. Verse 2 of Genesis 22, this God said, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love." I want to pause right here for a second and just tell you this little fact about the Bible. Genesis chapter 22 is the first place where we're presented with the idea, the concept, the word love. It's the first time we ever hear about love. Love, this thing we feel towards another person. God says to Abraham, the first time we ever know the concept, take this son whom you love and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham loads up his son, his servant, and some supplies, and he's going to go build an altar on Mount Moriah. His son's old enough to travel with him, like they're talking along the way, and he's going to lay him on the altar and sacrifice him. And you read the story, and Abraham does all this stuff. Like it's like, kill your son whom you love. And so Abraham builds the altar, and it's like you just kind of wonder, like if I'm the kid, I'm like taking my chances in the woods, right? Abraham's building it all, and then he puts his son on the altar and grabs the knife, and he's gonna do this thing. And right before he does it, this God who speaks says, "Stop. There's a ram that's caught in a thicket around the corner. I want you to go get it. And I want you to sacrifice it instead." And so Abraham goes and he gets this ram and he sacrifices the ram. And Isaac's probably going, "Is that where we were headed with that thing?" Right? And the story ends with God providing a way. Now, I want to be perfectly transparent about this story, if you don't mind, just for a moment. But I hear people all the time talk about Abraham's faith, and the Bible describes the faith of Abraham. And then I look at this story and I say, do you realize that the faith of Abraham meant that he was willing, he was willing to kill his son on this altar? That somebody needs to call like CPS, right? Like we need to get somebody over here, right? Like, do you realize what's going on? This is one of those things that you look at the story and you go, religion is so regressive. Religion is so primitive. Like, how in the world could we look at Abraham's faith and yet here's an individual who was perfectly willing to kill his son? How's that faith? How does that show us that God loves us? How in the world does this tell the story of God? Like, what is this? A couple of observations from this. How come Abraham doesn't object? I mean, why doesn't he object? Why doesn't he say, "No, I'm not going to do this"? Not only that, but if you think about this story and you look at it, why doesn't Abraham say to this God, "Well, how do I do this? How do I sacrifice my son?" If you notice the story, do you know what he does? He just gathers his supplies and he goes to do it. He already knew how. Why doesn't he reject? Why doesn't he ask questions? Why is he not shocked when a divine being asks him to kill the son whom he loves? Because this is how the gods have always acted. They always demanded what was most precious. So Abraham, just being a person of his day, is just doing what people of his day did. And then, as he's about to do it, God says, "Stop. Stop." Is this God making a point? Is this God using the altar as a prop? Is this whole thing God saying to Abraham, "You are used to gods who demand your children. You're used to gods who demand a sacrifice, who demand the thing that's most valuable to you, stop. It's a whole new day. It is a whole new day, and I am a completely different God. And so this story doesn't end with the greatness of Abraham. It actually ends with a statement about God, that this God provides. This God provides. This God is unlike all the other gods. This God provides. And this fundamental human posture that exists, this question we're always asking, like, what do I have to give the gods to keep them happy? That question is eradicated from our hearts. This story ends with the God who is providing, not a person who's providing something for him. It's completely reversed. Nobody in human history at this moment in time had ever heard of this ever before. Nobody had ever heard of a God who provided rather than a person providing for God. Like, this had never happened before. The Old Testament's telling these stories about a God who's different. If you turn to the third book of the Old Testament, the book of Leviticus, anyone ever read the book of Leviticus? Anyone ever dove into that? It's a definitely great bedtime reading material. Those of you that raised your hand, good for you. Has anyone ever read the full book of Leviticus? The hands all go down, right? Everyone's like, well, yeah, I read the first chapter. Because the book of Leviticus essentially is an instruction book on how to kill things and then what to do with those things once you've killed them. That's basically the book of Leviticus Cliff Notes version, right? But what's fascinating is you look at the book of Leviticus and there are all these sacrifices that are outlined for people. This is what you do and yada, yada, yada. There's this one particular sacrifice, the third sacrifice that's outlined in Leviticus, that's based on the idea of shalom. It's actually named after the Hebrew concept of shalom, which is human flourishing and peace with God and man. There's this sacrifice and God gives the instructions. He says, I want you to still use the altar, but here's what I want you to do. I want you to take something. I want you to take this thing, whatever it is, meat, grain, and I want you to put it on the altar, and I want you to take some of it and put it there. But the rest I want you to take, and I want you to have a feast. I want you to have a celebration, a meal with your family. And what you're celebrating is shalom, is peace with God, that you know peace with God. So whether it was with Abraham or with the book of Leviticus, God is sending a brand new message. This isn't offering something and then wondering in fear and in insecurity, are the gods going to be happy with me? Now we have a God whom you can know you're at peace with. This is a revolution. Wait, are you kidding me? You can't know who God is? He's so distant. How could you know God? Now we have people sitting around tables together, giving a little bit of a sacrifice and reminding themselves, we have peace with God. Naturally, this took off. People heard this, and people got excited, and they said, we don't have to live this way anymore. We don't have to live as slaves to these old religious systems that we were once a part of. We don't have to sacrifice our children anymore. And so, obviously, this began to build steam. And in the city of Jerusalem, they built a really big altar, a really massive one, and they hired all kinds of priests, and these priests rotated in shifts, and people came. In fact, in the spring, over Passover, this time of year, it's reported in history that 200,000 to 300,000 people a year would make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem to make sacrifices on this altar. In fact, the drains of that altar ran into the river Kidron outside of Jerusalem, and history says that the sacrifices during the spring were so great that the river ran red with blood. Because there was a whole new way of relating to God. We don't have to wonder anymore. We can know God. Unfortunately, there was this drift that took place. There was a group of individuals who had control over the sacrificial system. They made money off the sacrificial system. Their wealth and power grew. People's insecurities grew. And eventually, what God had instituted as a way of eradicating religion became a rite and a religion in itself. See, we have this thing inside of us where we like to do something about it. You know what I'm saying? It's fascinating for me when you read stories of individuals who have been really successful, people that were successful in business, or people that are successful in education, people that are successful in sports. There are oftentimes threads or themes that run through many of these people's stories, but there's one particular thread that runs through some of these stories that's always fascinating to me. There's always a segment of people who have succeeded in the athletic realm, or they succeeded in business, or they succeeded in education, and part of their story is that when you trace back, there was somebody along the way that said, you can't do it. There was somebody that failed that teacher in their freshman year math class. There was somebody who told that athlete, you're not going to make the team. There was somebody who told that business person, you'll never be successful. And inside of them, they said, what? I'm going to prove it to you. See, we do this as people. We want to prove it. We want to do something. We have this thing that says, I can fix this. And so we prove stuff to our dads, and we prove stuff to our moms, and we prove stuff to our peers. We prove it. We do something about the situation. There's something about being human that says, I'm going to figure this thing out. The problem with that is that still inside of us are these stories. There's still these experiences where we feel shame. Things that happen and we go, man, I don't want anybody to know about that. And we feel guilt and we think, man, I wish we could change that, but there's nothing we can do to make the guilt go away. We still, no matter how successful we are, we still have moments of insecurity, and we think, how in the world, with all that I've achieved, could I ever still be this insecure? We still want to do something about it. We want to resolve these things inside of us, which is why religion is so attractive. Maybe I can do something to fix this. Maybe if I do the right things, God will be happy. And he'll fix this. And so, people drifted. And what God had created turned into religion. Now, what's fascinating is there's this moment that takes place. When Jesus shows up on the scene. Do you remember what made Abraham's story unique? There was a God who came near, who spoke. And what made Abraham's story unique is that this God took the religious symbols of his past and he used them to point to a new way. And he took the sacrificial system of the civilizations and he transformed it and revealed a brand new way of understanding how human beings interact with God. And Jesus shows up on the scene. And they shall call his name Emmanuel, God with us. And what does Jesus do? When Jesus arrives on the scene, what's fascinating is that his very first actions are to intentionally desecrate religious icons. You read in John chapter 2, the wedding at Cana. This is the first miracle of Jesus. He's really gone unnoticed up until this point. Jesus is invited to a wedding by his mother, and he and his friends show up, and at this wedding there's this massive celebration and everybody's hanging out, and the wine runs out. The mother of Jesus comes and says, Mary says, Jesus, you need to do something about this. I know that you can, so why don't you do something about this? And Jesus scratches his head and he thinks something along the lines of, I'm not sure this is the way I want to get my career started. Like, this could be career suicide for a guy in my kind of work, right? So Jesus kind of pushes back and then somehow makes the decision that he's going to do it. And in the process of doing this, he does something really fascinating and interesting. Jesus tells the servants at the wedding, he says, I want you to grab these pots, these jars, these jugs of water, and listen to this in John chapter 2, verse 6. Look at what he instructs them to get. It says, now there were 6 stone water jars there. And what were they there for? For the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. These jars are there so that people could wash their hands. And the Jewish culture at this time had developed all of these rituals and rites and practices in order to try to keep God happy with them. And Jesus takes this religious icon and says, bring me those jars and fill them with water. Now, what's interesting about this is if people were sitting around a wedding and they had been drinking wine for quite a while and run out, what should there have been plenty of laying around? Empties, right? Like on bookshelves and windowsills and in the garbage and the recycling bin because they were green back then. There should be something that, like there should be empty wineskins or wine casks or wine barrels. Like if they've been drinking enough wine that they've run out, that means that there's something that was previously holding that wine. Which means that when Jesus looks around the room and sees those things, there's this intentional decision and he says, bring me those. And he turns the water into wine and intentionally desecrates a religious icon of the Jews. His first miracle. The first thing this new rabbi does is offend the religious establishment. And that was just the beginning. You think about Jesus, when Jesus chose to heal somebody, frequently he healed on the Sabbath. Why did he heal on the Sabbath? Because it was illegal. He broke the law. His disciples ate things they shouldn't have. They didn't wash their hands. His disciples alone, they didn't follow in the traditions of the religion. Like everything about Jesus is showing us, is pointing us, there's something broken with this religious tradition. As you get down towards the final week of his life, there's this scene in which Jesus bursts into the temple, into this place where this massive altar has been built and people have been worshiping and sacrificing. Jesus comes into this place where hundreds of thousands of people are taking a pilgrimage to so that they can feel okay about God. Jesus comes into this place and he says, there is one who stands in this place that is greater than all of this. If you ever wonder like about Jesus' saying, like if you ever go, man, was Jesus like crazy or was he not? Like this is one of those moments you go, do you realize what Jesus was saying? Like there is one greater. He was saying, listen, I am greater than all of this. In that same period of time, Jesus puts together a cord, a whip of sorts, with all of these several pieces of rope, and he comes bursting into the temple where people are making sacrifices. And because people had been on this long pilgrimage and they all wanted to feel okay, they all wanted to resolve the guilt, the shame, the insecurity, they all wanted to fix what was broken inside of them, they would come to this place and they needed something to sacrifice on the altar. So there were these people that had set up shop and they would exchange your money from whatever foreign land you were coming from so that you could then go buy something like a dove that you could put on the altar and have the priest sacrifice and then feel better and move on. And so Jesus comes in and he sees the exchange and really extraordinary. Like Goldman Sachs was in charge. Really high rates, right? They're making tons of cash. Investment bankers. The guys selling the doves, they're marking up things extraordinarily, and Jesus grabs this whip and starts just driving them out, like just pushing them out and like making this statement of, this is broken, this is ridiculous. Like Jesus is making a point, and that's how you made a point, by the way, back then. Like you got a whip, like you do that today in business, like get your tie on, walk in, like, okay, we've got this PowerPoint and here it is, and everyone's walking through, and then you're like, and here's my whip, right? They'll be calling HR so fast. Like, you're done, right? Don't do it. Guys, don't do it. Don't ever bring a whip into a business meeting. It's not a good idea. Ever. Ever. Jesus is making this point. 4 stories about Jesus called the Gospels. John is the one that we kind of call the 4th one. John says that Jesus is standing in the temple and there's a crowd of people and he says, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will rebuild it. Captain Obvious is over in the corner and he goes, it took us 46 years to build this. How do you plan on doing that, right? But John includes that detail to say, listen, Jesus is somehow identifying himself with this whole sacrificial system, and he's saying there is something new that's about to take place. There's something that's about to change, something that's going to be unlike anything that came before. Jesus is saying that there's something greater that's happening through him. He's saying, I'm bringing judgment to this thing that's happening. I'm telling you, this hasn't worked. It's irrelevant. He mystically identifies with the temple and says, destroy me, kill me, destroy me. And 3 days later, there'll be something new, something fresh. He will render this obsolete. Religion in this moment is being reversed. Jesus is reversing religion. Those that are protecting the religious system, the Sadducees, the individuals who were in charge of this, the Sadducees, they were making a lot of money off of guilt and shame. That doesn't happen these days at all, right? They can't allow this to happen. They have to protect their way of life. And their actions of protection actually eradicate the very system that they were seeking to protect. The loved one, this loved one of God is sacrificed. And there's this moment when Jesus is on the cross when I think for all of us we have to look and think, wait a second, and did God cave to the religious system? I think there's this moment where you look at the crucifixion and you say, is this it? Like if this is it, if it stops at the crucifixion, then that means that God just jumped in line with the whole system of violence and religion and like, is that what it is? But on the third day, Mary Magdalene is going to the tomb because she wants to make sure the body of Jesus wasn't cared for in haste. And she arrives and the stone's gone and his body's not there. And she assumes what everybody else assumes, and that's that somebody's taken the body. And then we read this remarkable thing in the Gospels, and all of them we read that there is this physical, bodily, real resurrection of Jesus. Jesus stands before his disciples. He gets in front of them and says, the sacrifices are done. Religion is over. The things that you thought you had to do to find favor with God, you no longer have to do them because God has done something for you. Religion is reversed. That's what Jesus says. That's the point of the resurrection. That religion has been reversed. You have favor because of what God did. God is presenting this whole new, this upside down, alternate reality. He's saying, listen, you have this with me. You have my favor. You have peace with me. You don't have to offer me anything to find that. You don't have to do anything to find that. Like, I'm doing this for you. Do you realize at the heart of every single religious system in the world is built around one fundamental idea, and that idea is that you and I have to do something, behave a particular way, jump through a particular set of hoops, follow a particular set of rules in order for God to be pleased with us. Except Jesus. Jesus is completely the opposite. The gospel says exactly the opposite. It's not about what you do. It's about what God has already done for you. Peace has been made. He's done it all. So the question is, I think for us, for all of us, is what is your God like? What is your God like? Like, who is your God? And maybe some of you say, well, I don't really have a God. We all believe in something. We all trust something. What is your God like? what is it that you trust in? Who are you trusting in? What is he like? I mean, that's the question that God was posing to Abraham and the culture around him. It's the question that Jesus poses to everybody else. Like, what is your God like? At the deepest level, what is your God like? So I wonder that with all of our education and all of our technology and all of our advancements, that we're the most modern, brilliant people in all of history. I just wonder if we're still as primitive as we were in Genesis chapter 11. That with our desire for success, our desire for acceptance, our desire for security, our desire for the shame to go away, our desire for the guilt to be gone, that our desire for those things just has us living religiously, behaving, doing anything we can to change that. We try to dull the senses, we try to shove those things down, we try to make it go away, and yet those things keep pressing to the surface. And so here we are, this sophisticated, educated society, but don't we still have these altars? And we're saying, I just want to feel better about this. That is why the resurrection still matters. The resurrection still matters. The resurrection looks at your life and my life and says, there is something to this. There is something that is in you, and there is something that you have tried to figure out. But when we look to the resurrection, we say, God did something to resolve that in us. God has done something to fix that. We're going to take a few moments and we're going to pray and we're going to reflect. Would you pray with me? Jesus, I think all of us recognize and acknowledge the fact that we live our lives trying to figure things out, trying to resolve and answer the questions. I pray that we would see that regardless of where we come from, regardless of our story, regardless of what it is that's even brought us into this place, that your resurrection speaks to us. Would you now allow us to hear what you have to say about our lives? I pray this in your name. Amen. Let's take some time and let's reflect together. That's the story of the Bible. The story of the Bible is not God establishing religions, rites, and rituals that we're supposed to behave in order for him to be happy with us. The story of the Bible is a story of a God who sees his people, humanity, and he says, I love you, and I want to liberate you from that sort of life. I want to heal the guilt and the anxiety. I want to alleviate the shame. I want to take away the pain that's in your life. I want to rewrite your story. I want you to be awake. I want you to be alive. I want to bring color back to your world. It's as if God, the same God who stood and spoke to Abraham, the same God who came as Christ and walked this planet is now saying to us, and whether it's you living a religious life hoping to somehow please God, or maybe it's you following the irreligious systems of our culture, whatever the case is, God looks at us and says, stop. It's not about what you do. The gospel is not about what we do. The resurrection says it is all about what God has done for us. And the striving is over. The effort is over. Life is now lived, this life of celebration. A life that just says, man, there's a God. And he has risen. Amen. Would you stand with me? For some of you today, maybe you've been living very religiously for a very long time, and maybe your view of God, and maybe it's been right in the middle of living around the church. Maybe you've just been living and saying, man, I just drifted and turned Jesus into a religion. And for some of you, it might be time to be viewing things in a whole new way. For others of you, maybe it is just that you've been living distant because you rejected that primitive ancient religion that God also happened to reject. And now you're saying, man, I need to know more. Whatever the case is, the program that you got when you walked in today has a few simple steps. How do you get started? How do you start living in relationship with this God? How do you know this resurrected Jesus? We've also got Bibles for you. If you want to start reading a Bible that'll help you understand that, we've got a bunch of them for you for free. And there's going to be some people after the service. If this has stirred questions for you that you just want to talk with someone or pray with someone, you can come down and talk with them. But may you be men and women who understand who the resurrected Jesus is. May you be men and women who understand that Jesus was reversing religion. May you understand in the core of your being that what resolves the guilt and the shame and the anxiety, what solves the question of your heart, is not religious behavior, but it's the behavior of a God who acted on your behalf. May you live a life with eyes wide open. May you live in full color. May you live in relationship with the God who is and always will be. Amen. Amen. Thank you for being here. Let's celebrate our risen Lord today. Amen.